There is a mechanic in the Pokemon TCG that is always meta-defining whenever it exists. But despite that, the player base absolutely can't stand it. It actively makes them angry whenever it returns in any capacity. And it's a mechanic that has existed in the game since 2008. And today, we're going to look at it in extremely high detail. The most hated Pokemon mechanic of all time. The mechanic is quite a simple one. Attacks that let you take extra prize cards if you KO something. In the Pokemon TCG, you have to take 6 prize cards to win the game. Normally, this would involve KOing 6 of your opponent's Pokemon cards to win. But with the influx of some Pokemon being worth 2 prize cards, or sometimes even 3 prize cards when they get KO'd, being able to take extra prize cards against them can make games end super fast or get out of hand very quickly. So with that quick crash course, let's take a look at the first card that could take extra prize cards if you KO something with it. That is Cresselia level X. The first time we ever saw an attack that would take extra prize cards, I'll be honest, it was pretty underwhelming. In fact, it wasn't even the best part of the card. Cresselia level X had the Moon Skip attack, which would take an extra prize card if you KO anything with it. Its Poke Power Full Moon Dance would let you move one damage counter from one Pokemon to another one once per turn. This saw play in a 2008 US Nationals winning deck guarded Gallade, which was the best deck at format in the time, and quite honestly could be the best deck of all time, period. But it must be said Gino was playing a super tricked out version of the deck that was playing Breloom, Pachirisu, and Jirachi EX too. Cresselia was mostly played here just for its Poke Power, since Gengar 50% of the time would KO your own Pokemon if it got knocked out via damage from an attack. So what some players would do is try and set up the Gengar to be KO'd via any other way apart from damage. Often this would involve using power based damage like Crobat G, who would put one damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon when you put it into play. So in order to use Crobat G to KO a Gengar and get around its Poke Power, you would have to leave it with 10 HP left, then bench the Crobat. Now quite honestly, this wasn't an easy thing to do, so you often had to play Ring Around the Rosies to get that set up. Cresselia would help Gengar players avoid this by moving damage from the Gengar every turn, making life very hard for players trying to get around Gengar. But again, in this deck, you probably wouldn't actually attack with Cresselia. So with that in mind, taking extra prizes wasn't immediately impactful, sure. But don't worry, its slope to meta dominance has started climbing. Next up was Salamence level X. It looks like a killer on face value, but when you dive into it, which we will, it starts to look like it was all raw and only a little bit of bite. Its double 4 Poke Power would let you take an extra prize card if your Salamence KO'd something on the turn you put the level X into play. This was a pretty unique effect. This would let double 4 have a massive effect on the game, except there was a couple things holding Salamence back. First up, the attack damage on Salamence just wasn't very good, with metagame threats like Gyarados having 130 HP at the time, meaning Steam Blast was just missing KOs. Now you could use the Stormfront Salamence Steam Twister, which would deal 120 damage, and its Battle Rush Poke Body would allow you to remove the colourless energy cost in the attack if your opponent had any Pokemon in play that had 100 HP or more. This was actually very useful, meaning Steam Twister was now dealing 120 damage for a fire and a water energy, which to be fair, was pretty good. And if you were sitting into something that had more HP, like that Gyarados from earlier, you could just use Expert Belt. You could even play the Arceus Salamence, who had the top accelerator power, which would let you look at the top card of your deck, and if it was a basic energy, you could attach it to any one of your Pokemon. This on face value doesn't sound like the most reliable, sure, unless you was to have Delcatty, which would let you put 2 basic energy from your discard pile on the top of your deck. Meaning now, top accelerator was guaranteed to hit consistently. This gave Salamence level X a few tips and tricks. Enough tricks to where it could win a Cities Championship via Guy Bennett. However, it failed to gain any more traction outside of this, mostly due to the best deck in format guarded Gallade, which would stop you from using Double Fall due to Psychic Lock, and later on Garchomp C level X would actually slap your Salamence for weakness. Not very good. So far it hasn't looked very good for our taking extra prizes attack. However, The next one immediately was thrown into World Championship contention and was in the best deck and format at the time. Rayquaza Deoxys Legend. This was very strong, but due to some massive drawbacks, it didn't see any play, at least for a little while. The Legend cards are all stunning, to be fair, all being a combination of two different cards that required you both to get them in the hand at the same time before you could put them into play. Now, if the Legend card featured two different Pokemon on them, then if the Legend card got KO'd, it would actually be worth 2 prize cards. So it was pretty hard to get the Legends into play, and if they got KO'd, it would actually be disastrous for you. So immediately it was an uphill struggle for Rayquaza Deoxys Legend. But luckily for us, it had a pretty insane Poke power. Meant that if it was to ever KO anything, you would take an additional prize card. And Pokemon have learned their lesson. They made sure its attack Ozone Buster dealt a massive 150 damage, meaning you wasn't have to faff around like you was with Salamence earlier. We was KOing things in one mighty swing. Meaning if you could announce Ozone Buster 3 times in a row, you would win games, taking 2 prize cards every single time. The hard part of doing that though was that you'd have to discard all fire energy attached to Rayquaza Deoxys whenever you announced Ozone Buster. And it's that massive drawback that kept it back from the strictly highest meta game play. That was until Black and White would roll around, and then we saw one massive buff for Rayquaza Deoxys Legend, and that card was Emboar. Emboar had the Inferno Fandango ability, which would let you accelerate as many fire energy from your hand to your Pokemon. We have seen this ability all the way back in base set, and we have seen it since with Blastoise and Baxcalibur. Every time it's been very strong. Emboar would make a ton of different attackers viable, like Reshiram, who is in the same set, and later on Rayquaza EX, and out the gates Magnezone Prime, who would let you draw cards via its Pokepower Magnetic Draw, and would offer huge nuke attack, letting you Lost Zone as many energy as you like attached to your Pokemon, and you would deal 50 for each one you chose to send to the Lost Zone. This provided massive consistency via Emboar, draw power via Magnezone, and Rayquaza Deoxys to be a huge beat stick, and this became a bona fide tier 1 archetype. Inferno Fandango meant that 4 energy cost for Ozone Buster was laughable, to be honest, and even though you had to discard the energy to use the attack, you could just get them all back via energy retrieval or fisherman, so it was very easy to reload those energy, meaning multiple uses of Ozone Buster if your Rayquaza Deoxys Legend was left unchecked was very easy to do. So easy and strong in fact that Rayquaza Deoxys Legend was in the champion deck from the 2011 World Championships, where it toppled Ross Cawthorn's Truth deck in the finals. And after that fantastic finish, Magnezone would actually get ditched from the deck in favour of Reshiram to save on deck space, allowing players to beef out cards to make Rayquaza Deoxys easier to use, like Twins, extra copies of Fisherman, and even Indigo Plateau, which would make Rayquaza Deoxys even tankier and even easier to use. So with all this in mind, Rayquaza Deoxys has its place in Pokemon history, and it did it in very explosive fashion, just like our next card, Lugia EX. Lugia EX was in Plasma Storm, which reintroduced villainous cards back into the Pokemon TCG, which not only had these stunning blue borders, might I say, but it also had a ton of different support cards that would interact with Plasma cards in different ways. For example, Plasma Energy would let Plasma Pokemon's attacks have different effects. For example, if Thundurus EX had a Plasma Energy attached, Thunderous Noise would now discard an energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon as well. Chorus Machine would let you attach a Plasma Energy from your deck to one of your Plasma Pokemon, and Team Plasma Ball would allow for free search of a Plasma Pokemon. All this support made Plasma Pokemon a real force to be reckoned with. Kyurem was one of the premier Plasma attackers out the gate, with Frost Spear providing decent damage from a 1-prize Pokemon with bench access as well, and Blizzard Burn would reach huge numbers with a little bit of help from Plasma's best friend Deoxys EX. Deoxys EX had the Power Connect ability that would boost your Plasma Pokemon's attacks damage by 10 for each one you had in play. So Blizzard Burn with 3 Deoxys out and a Hypnotoxic Laser Verbank combo would now hit 180 damage, the magic number for one-shotting EX Pokemon in the format, all on our little 1-prize Pokemon too. And as good as Kyurem was, eventually he had to step aside for an even stronger, more terrifying attacker to be the focal point, and that was Lugia EX. Not only is this card stunning, but its overflow ability was nuts. If Lugia EX KO'd a Pokemon with its attack, you would take an extra prize card. This would let Lugia EX attack 3 times into 1 prize dex to win the game, or twice into 2 prize decks if you was to one-shot EX Pokemon. Which, to be fair, was very easy, since even though Plasma Gale's damage at 120 seemed low, with a Horde of Deoxys in play and a Muscle Band, we would get to that magic 180 damage easier. And considering the big deck at the time was Genesect Virizion, a deck that revolved around 100 HP Virizion and an 180 HP Genesect EX, you could win the game in 2 turns, with 2 Plasma Gales, speed at which that deck couldn't keep up with. Plasma Gale would also blow through Keldeo EX, Yveltal EX, and Landorus EX too, making it a deadly speed aggressive deck that didn't care what it played against. Double Colorless Energy and 2 uses of Colress Machine would allow you to get Plasma Gale swinging in a single turn, meaning you could take 3 prize cards as early as your first turn of the game, and to be honest, it was quite likely to have happened. I adored this deck, and so did Vincent Azolin, as he took this deck to a 7th place finish at the 2004 World Championships, with the deck also getting an additional top 32 at that event. Lugia did also feature in the 2nd place 2013 World Championship deck too, but that time it was more of a secondary attacker, Takuro. This would cement Lugia EX as one of the best aggressive decks of all time. And taking extra prizes wasn't set to be done there. Since next up we have a few cards with the Delta Plus Ancient trait. Now, in the ORAS era of the Pokemon TCG, we were introduced to Ancient traits. These were kind of like abilities that couldn't really be interfered with. There was an Evolution one, which would let you evolve a Pokemon the same turn it was put into play, bypassing normal evolution rules. There was also Barrier, which would stop your opponent's trainers from working on the Pokemon with Barrier, stopping you from using stuff like Lysandre on it, for example. There was the Growth Ancient trait that would let you attach extra energy. There was the Max Ancient trait, which would let you heal damage when you evolved into it. And for the most part, all of these ancient traits saw play. Except there was another one, Plus, that saw a lot of play as well. You see, Plus would let you take an extra prize card if the Pokemon that had Plus KO something. In order to keep this balanced, it wasn't given to many Pokemon, and the ones that had it were genuinely underwhelming. For example, this little Natu, awful. This Swellow also wasn't very good, although I did try to make it work with the type adding evolutions, so Swellow was now hitting for a ton of different weaknesses at the same time. Still wasn't very good though. Then there was Articuno. This one was very, very good. Tri-Edge would deal 20 damage plus 40 for each heads you flip from 3 coins. And realistically, you would only need to flip 1 heads for Articuno to do its job. You see, at the time, Night March was an extremely powerful deck. It would use little Pokemon like Pumpkaboo and Joltik to deal massive damage, since Night March would deal 20 for each Night March Pokemon you had in the discard pile. This would often result in massive one-shots, but it left you attacking with very little HP small Pokemon. And with that in mind, in steps Articuno, who now only needs to flip 1 heads to KO all of them, take an extra prize card, and only give up 1 prize card in return. This was so effective at swinging the Night March matchup that Articuno featured in the 2015 World Championship winning deck Archie's Blastoise, where Jacob Van Wagner would get Blastoise into play turn 1 via Archie's, then you pile a ton of energy onto Keldeo EX for Big Secret Swords turn 1, or Big Tri-Edges versus Night March, which actually came up in his top 4 game, meaning that whilst most of the Delta Plus cards were pretty trash, Articuno featured in a World Championship deck, and it continued to see play in the Archie's Blastoise archetype in the expanded format as well. Next up we have Guzzlord GX, which on paper looks scary. A basic Pokemon, 210 HP at the time, massive. Being an Ultra Beast meant you could abuse support cards like Ultra Space to get it into play, or use Beast Ring to attach energy to it, very nice. And that GX attack, oh boy! Glutton GX would deal 100 damage. However, if you KO'd something, you would take an additional 2 prize cards. So that means if you was to use this to KO a lowly little 1 prize Pokemon like Eevee, you would take 3 prize cards while doing so. Or, if you was to set up a GX Pokemon to KO it with this, you would take 4 prize cards in a single turn. That's actually insane when you think about it. And to be fair, if you could pull it off was capable of winning games right then and there. The only problem was that pesky 5 dark energy attack cost, although there was a pretty memey way of getting it powered up though. Each sloppily would discard the top 5 cards of your deck, and you could attach as many energy cards as you found there to the Guzzlord. So in the standard format, some players would play 4 Guzzlord GX and 56 energy, so each sloppily would now immediately power up a Guzzlord ready to go. This in theory could work though, since the other attack tyrannical hole is just about usable, dealing 180 damage for 5 energy, which would KO a lot of the basic Pokemon in format in one hit, and if you were to use Choice Band, you would actually hit 210, which was a much better number for dealing with the rest of the format. The problem with this strategy though, is that it was actually very hard to get the next Guzzlord set up after the first one went down, since you would have to take a turn off using each sloppily, and it was actually really hard to find the choice belts, since you had to play so many energy to make the each sloppily effective, since if you was to miss, 1 energy or 2, you would now instantly lose the game. This meant Guzzlord was nothing more than a meme deck. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom for Guzzlord, since it did get a 12th place finish at Dallas Expanded Regionals, where Grant Manley would use it in a sort of dark toolbox deck. We had other attackers like Darkrai EX, Greninja Zoroark and Weavile GX to move the dark energy around. This meant you could drop Guzzlord at any time if Glutton GX was live. And with a single reverse valley, you would now hit 110 damage, which was the perfect amount to KO a Shaymin EX in one hit, taking 4 prize cards. You could even use Marshadow GX to copy the attack, but now you can be hitting for fighting weakness at the same time. Mega Sabltar would operate in a similar way to Guzzlord, but it came out a few sets later. It's similar in the fact that it attacks for 5 energy and has the potential to take extra prize cards, except Greedy Crush was actually usable and saw a lot of meta gameplay. Greedy Crush would deal 210 damage, and if you KO'd an EX or GX Pokemon, you would take an extra prize card. Now 210 was a great number, because it would reach format staples like the Dedenne GX, which everyone was playing by the way, Zoroark, which was a lot of the format, and Tapu Lele, which was in every deck again, turning them all into 3 prize KO, meaning if you could use Greedy Crush twice, you could win the game. Weavile GX would let you move around dark energy, so in theory you could bench Sabltar and get it swinging in a single turn, meaning it was quite hard for your opponent to play around it. Naganadel would let you get extra energy in play via its ability charging up, and it would also be a beast ring target to get even more energy into play, and Weavile could move them straight off the Naganadel. You also had the deadly attacking core of Umbreon Darkrai, who would KO anything and stop your opponent from playing any items afterwards, Zoroark Umbreon, who was just a huge beat stick, and Sabltar, which would take extra prize cards. This whole core was so good that it resulted in a top 16 finish at the 2019 World Championships via Zach Krekler, and a 79th place finish via good friend Adam Hawkins, and it also got a top 8 placement at the Players Cup 4 Global Finals too. However, the next card we're about to see got even more sillier, and it's probably something we'll never see again. Formosa Buzzwole was up next, and it had 3 attacks. Jet Punch was fine, dealing 30 damage to the active and 30 to a bench Pokemon. Pretty good for setting up early game damage, or setting stuff up for Elegant Soul, which was Buzzmosa's other attack, which would deal 190 damage and then 60 next turn. This wasn't very good on its own. However, what it was good at is setting things up for Beast Game GX. Beast Game GX would deal 50 damage for 1 energy, and if you KO'd something, you would take an additional prize card. This got played in a ton of decks just for this effect, like Zapdos decks, and later on Mewtwo tag team decks as well. This would feature in regional winning decks like the first place deck at Sydney Regionals and first place at the Origins Open, since Buzzmosa was mostly here to help Zapdos decks with one of the tougher matchups, Malamar, since Malamar would keep throwing up bulky Giratinas at you, which Zapdos really didn't deal with well, since it was a bulky one prizer that was constantly one-shotting you, and you would have to commit a ton of electro powers to make sure you would KO it back. In steps Buzzmosa though, since it would plow through one of these and take 2 prize cards whilst doing so, as long as you tagged it first with a Zapdos, and that means you would have the rest of your electro powers to close out the rest of the game. But this wasn't part of your every game plan though, since Zapdos decks would often play Tapu Koko GX as well for big Tapu Thunder GX plays, which would deal 50 for each energy attached to all your opponent's Pokemon. This meant Buzzmosa was often an afterthought, only played for certain matchups. The deck I'm more concerned about for Buzzmosa though was a Pheromosa Buzzwole only deck. So that's it, 4 Buzzmosa, 10 Grass Energy and 1 Beast Energy. Beast Energy would boost the Ultra Beast damage it was attached to by 30. So now Beast Game was dealing 80, with a Choice Bandits 110. Now we are getting somewhere. However, where this extra damage really shines was with Jet Punch and Elegant Soul, since now you can reliably set up tag team Pokemon to get down into range of Beast Game. And that was the only job for the first Buzzmosa. Maybe take a couple prizes with Jet Punch, but you were really there to set up a multi-prize Pokemon to get in range of Beast Game. Because if you did, you had the game wrapped up instantly. Since if Buzzmosa had an extra 7 energy attached to it, Beast Game would take an additional 3 prize cards if you KO'd something. Did you hear me correctly? Meaning you could take 6 prize cards in one attack if you KO'd a tag team Pokemon with Beast Game. So in an ideal world, your second Buzzmosa would come in, you would play 3 Beast Rings to get this energy attached, fling 1 more from your hand, and boom! Beast Game for game. Green's Exploration would help out with this strategy, letting you grab any 2 trainer cards if you had no abilities in play, which you obviously wouldn't. However, if the perfect Dreamer scenario wasn't at hand, you had a backup plan, since you could play Lieutenant Surge's strategy, which would let you play an additional 2 supporter cards this turn. So what you do is use a Green's Exploration after that to find a Beast Ring, or maybe another Green's, but also a Lusamine Prism Star, which was a supporter card which would protect your Ultra Beast from all damage next turn if your opponent had 3 prize cards left, which they always would because you're only playing tag team Pokemon. This meant now you had an additional turn to not only get damage into play, attached for a big Beast Game. This was such a successful plan that it won the Champions League event in Chiba, and quite honestly was one of the coolest cards I've ever seen. Next up though, oh boy, this was where the real hate in the community's hearts come from. Arceus Palkia Dialga. It didn't immediately light the Pokemon TCG world on fire, but the power level was definitely obvious. Ultra Creation GX would make your Pokemon do an extra 30 damage for the rest of the game. And if you had an additional energy attached to that Pokemon when you used it, all your Pokemon for the rest of the game would take an extra prize card whenever they KO'd something. Out of the gates, ADP was a solid tier 1, maybe a tier 2 deck. Its partner was Keldeo GX, who couldn't be hit by GX Pokemon thanks to its ability, meaning after an Ultra Creation boost, its attack was carrying all 1 prize Pokemon in format that could actually hit through it, like Giratina, and it was walling out the rest of the format at the same time thanks to its ability. In order to prevent players from countering the Keldeo with Power Plant, which would turn off its ability, ADP players would play Chaotic Swell, which would immediately discard any stadium that replaced it from play. The problem with this deck though, is that it 100% relied on using Ultimate Ray to set up the Keldeo. Ultimate Ray was a very good attack though, dealing 150 damage or 180 after using Ultra Creation, and attach 3 energy from your deck to your Pokemon in any way you like. If you could pull this off, you was normally in a very good spot, especially if you could KO with the Dene with it, since 180 damage would now reach over the top of its 160 HP. However, if the ADP went down before you could use Ultimate Ray, you were twiddling your thumb. This meant ADP was good, but still counterable. This was until Sword and Shield came out. Then it became the most hated deck of all time, and in my opinion was uncounterable. Once Zacian V came out, ADP was the undisputed best deck in format by far. Zacian blew Keldeo GX out of the water. Brave Blade would deal a table shattering 230 damage for 3 energy, making a mockery of 2 prize Pokemon. And after the AC buff, it was now hitting for 260, which after a Vitality Band, which would boost damage by 10, and a Zigzagoon Ping, which was basically Crobat G, you could KO anything in the game, including tag teams, while taking an extra prize card too. Do you know how silly that is? Also had an ability, Intrepid Sword, which would let you grab the top 3 cards from your deck. It would end your turn, but if there was any metal energy there in those top 3, you could attach them, giving you extra cards to start the game using it on your first turn, and get extra energy attachments too. It wasn't all about the boosted firepower and consistency though, since Zacian V also came with Metal Saucer, which was a godsend for the deck. It was this Metal Saucer that made ADP Z a nightmare to deal with, since now you can set up Zacian V without the use of Ultimate Ray, which was a godsend for the deck. This meant the old weakness of ADP decks was now null and void. You were one-shotting everything, you could set up your Zacian without using Ultimate Ray, and there was nothing your opponent could realistically do about it. More Wild Jets could cheat your opponent's Pokemon into play without them even wanting to, like forcing a Dedenne GX into play without them being able to use the ability, which was devastating in its own right. And then Boss's Orders came out. And after that, you didn't even care what was in your opponent's active. You would spam Crobats to draw cards, find your Metal Saucers, play them, then use Boss's Orders to bring up whatever you could KO with Zacian, which was quite a lot of the format by the way, and then take a big 3-prize KO. This was so consistent that it led to the term Boss game, being a phrase uttered in the community. Since if ADP went first, they would just use Alter Creation, then play 2 Boss's Orders on back-to-back turns to KO whatever they liked and wrap the game up. And quite honestly, there was not a lot you could do as the opponent about it. And trust me when I say the player base despised it. They hate it. They hated it. Its combination of draw power, more wild and raw damage output made it very tough to play against. And if it wasn't for the circuit getting suspended, I'm sure it would have got a ton of high level event success as well. But even with the circuit being suspended, ADP made its mark in Pokemon history and it will never be forgotten. After that, Pokemon were very careful with how they gave Pokemon the extra prize mechanic. Stoutland V out of the gates was a bulk card. Since Double Dip Fangs would deal 40 damage and if it carried a basic Pokemon, you would take an extra prize card. 40 damage wasn't enough to KO a basic Pokemon on its own, and since it needed 3 energy to attack, it wasn't very viable to sort of set it up and then bring Stoutland in after to finish something off. Greedent VMAX fell into a similar vein, with Turn of Profit almost being identical to Double Tip Fangs, except it was for 1 less energy, did 10 less damage, but it did take 2 extra prize cards instead of 1 if it KO'd something. And this meant even though Turn of Profit was very strong, probably game winning on its own if it was to ever come off, it was just way too hard to get set up to be used. And that should have been it for these 2 cards. But then in Silver Tempest, a little 1-2 punch brought these cards from the bulk boxes and thrust them into the best deck in format at the time, and in my opinion, the best deck ever printed. Archeops will let you attach 2 special energy from your deck to one of your Pokemon once per turn, and Lugia V-Star would let you grab 2 colorless Pokemon from your discard pile and put them straight into play. This meant you could get 2 Archeops into play turn 2 very easily. And after that, you could get any attacker you like set up, since you'd now have 4 special energy to attach from the deck. How does this relate to Stoutland V? Well, powerful energy existed, meaning the colorless Pokemon this card was attached to would deal an extra 20 damage, and this would stack. So if you have multiple of these attached, you're now doing an extra 40 to 60 damage. This meant you could get an extra 80 damage onto Stoutland in a single turn, meaning Double Dip Fangs was now super viable. In fact, it was crucial in combating one of the best decks at the time, Lost Box. Lost Box was similar to Night March, in the way that it would rely on lower HP Pokemon to attack/get set up, with Comfey having 70 HP and Sableye having 80. This meant Lugia players could now throw up Stoutland against them and force them to immediately have an answer to it, because if they didn't, they would pretty much lose straight away, since they couldn't afford to give up 4 prize cards to 1 Stoutland, meaning Stoutland was now a staple in the best deck in format. Greedent VMAX could be used in the same way as Stoutland, being even more game ending for these low HP decks, but it was slightly riskier to use since it was a stage 1. It did get 6th place in Vancouver and a ton of other day 2 finishes as well, meaning even when Pokemon were trying to be super careful with the taking extra prize cards, it was still too strong. Crobat was set for greatness. Critical Bright would deal 30 damage to any one of your opponent's Pokemon, and if it KO'd something, you would take an additional 2 prize cards. Being able to attack against any Pokemon meant it did have potential. I was actually tempted to bring this to NARC 2023 when paired with Meowscarada EX to try and end games fast. The Golbat could even help out by drawing cards when you evolved into it, and there was also a supporting Crobat too. However, its 3 energy attack cost was just too high to make work consistently, and even with reversal energy it was still too clunky, meaning this was probably the least successful extra prize taker in all history so far. Clefable will give that Crobat a run for its money though. More Moon would take an additional prize card if it KO'd something, dealing 50 damage for 3 energy. And even though there's a ton of ways to get those psychic energies into play, like Gardevoir EX and eventually, and even the basic Clefairy funnily enough, this has failed to see any metagame relevant play. Iron Hands EX is up next though, and oh boy, we are back in business. Ampy very much would deal 120 damage, and if you KO something, you would take an additional prize card too. And even though this costs 4 energy, it is meta defining. It's immediately won the first event it was legal for, LAIC 2024, where I was very close to watch it unfold. Back then it was paired in the Miraidon deck, where you would use Electric Generator and Flaffy to get those energies attached to Iron Hands. And Miraidon's tandem unit would search out all the basic lightning types you needed. More recently though, Iron Hands has been paired with Chen Power EX, since Baxcalibur can accelerate that 3 colorless energy cost via water energy, and Earthen Vessel would find the electric energy needed to attack. You could even use Superior Energy Retrieval to grab back 4 energy from the discard pile, ready to attach to your Iron Hands EX, making Chen Power solid tier 1 tier 2 deck while it has existed. And now we're set to see Iron Hands paired with Lugia V-Star, making use of Legacy Energy, which provides any color energy, and while it's attached to a Pokemon, if that Pokemon was to get KO'd, you'd actually give up 1 less prize card once per game. Meaning now Iron Hands take an extra prize card, but it also give up 1 less prize card too when it gets KO'd. This is gross, and Iron Hands still has so much format left to go, and it's got countless top cut placements under its belt, and quite honestly, I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. So with all that being said and done, we can see just how impactful taking extra prize cards can be in the Pokemon TCG, and why the player base hates it so much. I think it's that as the opponent you can't really do anything about it, that just winds people up, and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. Real quick, I have to give a shout out to this video sponsor, Dragon Shield. They make the best accessories in the game, and if you want to get your hands on some and save yourself some money, click the link down there and use my code BURST to get 5% off, and it helps me out too. Let's get back to the video.